Alright, so this is one of the most common errors that you're going to get inside of Integromat or Make. It's a operation timeout error. Now, this happens for a number of reasons, and one of the most common reasons that I see it happening is when someone has used a list or a search or a watch records module, some sort of polling type module, as a trigger, and there's been no changes for maybe 10 days, 30 days, whatever it is. And so this, Integromat's basically polling this endpoint, this data source, and it's saying, hey, let me know if there's any changes. And the data source is like, nope, no changes. And Integromat's like, hey, let me know if there's any changes. It's like, nope, no changes. And it just keeps doing that, it keeps bugging this data source. And eventually the server just goes, nope, you've annoyed me too much, go away. And essentially it just goes, I'm just going to ignore you. And so Integromat will just sit there and it'll just wait for a response. And what happens is it times out, right? It doesn't get a response, so it times out. So that's the most common thing that I see happening in terms of an error. You will also get the same sort of error within the actual scenario itself, so one of these other modules further down the line, particularly if you're making lots of changes or doing lots of calls and updates to one data source, such as like you're updating and then creating and doing a whole bunch of different rows inside of Airtable. You'll find that you'll get a timeout error because you're sending too many requests, or you might get an API limit error because you've sent too many requests. Quite often you'll just get a timeout error because the server will, most of the time it will just say, hey, chill out a bit. It won't say you've reached an API limit, although some servers will say that. So how to get around this? It's actually a very tricky one to solve, because how Integromat solves this or deals with this is it actually throws an error when it happens. And so this will stop your scenario from processing at a random point in the scenario. And if you've got 50 modules in a big scenario, it could be on any of those 50 modules that you get this timeout issue. So you really have to sort of think about and really get that timeout issue a couple of times to figure out why you're getting that issue. Are you getting this issue because you're sending too much data too quickly to the server? And quite interestingly, I found that this problem actually got worse when Integromat got sold to and became Make. And it was because when they changed the servers over, the new servers worked a lot faster than what the Integromat old servers did. And so the data was going across a lot faster to these third-party apps. And so I was getting a lot more API limits errors and a lot more timeout errors because the data was being sent a lot quicker and reaching those limits. So one of the ways that you can solve this is you can put a wait inside the scenario. That's one way to do it. So if we were to, if we go into a scenario here, or maybe this one here, we'll put just a sleep is what it's called in Integromat. So between a module, so particularly if you've got, say, Airtable, and you're doing like 20 different updates to Airtable, you might have that on a router, for instance. Airtable. There it is. So you might be sort of creating modules, and then you've got a router here, and you're doing 20 of these things all at once, right? Well, not all at once, but sequentially, and they're happening within fractions of a second. Okay? So if you're doing this, and wouldn't always be create, but it could be create, update, search, then update, then create, doing a whole bunch of things. What you could do is you could figure out, well, hey, look, I'm getting an error on like the third one usually, so therefore I can usually do maybe 3 of them before I get an error. So okay, well, to sort of get around that, I'm just going to put in a sleep here, and I'm just going to say, hey, look, chill out, Integromat, for like 1 second, right, when you get to this bit, and then continue, do your normal thing, and then chill out again after 3 of them, right? So you could do that, and that sometimes will get rid of that issue of the timeout, because you're telling Integromat to intentionally slow down. The problem that you're going to get here is each Integromat scenario has a maximum execution time, and it's 40 minutes. So if you put a long sleep, or you put a sleep before every module, whatever, you can very quickly make this scenario run very, very slowly, and you'll hit that 40-minute scenario limit very, very quickly and quite regularly. So you have to be quite sparing in your use of these sleep modules. Another way that you could do it, if it's just one particular module that keeps erroring, and it might be a module towards the end or at the beginning, whatever, you can put a break in, and you can just put that as an error handler. So when this particular module errors, we're then going to break, and they default it to 15 minutes here, but I mean, that's really way too long. I would put 1 minute. If it had a break of 15 minutes and you got a scenario execution time of 40 minutes, and you're doing 3 attempts of that, I'm not sure if these get added to the scenario execution time, but don't particularly want to find out. We also want to turn on allow storing incomplete executions for this to run correctly, and that's just under the settings here. But you can just plonk that on there and then automatically complete the execution. And so what will happen is now when we get a timeout error here, or in fact any error on this particular module, it's then going to chill out for 1 minute, right? And it's just going to say, oh look, I'll just hold that bundle of data for 1 minute, and then I'm going to retry again up to 3 retries on this module, and if it fails 3 times in a row, well then that's an actual failure of that particular module. So that's a good way to run it as well. Yeah, you could copy that and put it on every one of these modules if you really wanted to. It's probably a bit overkill, but that would solve the problem. If it's a really important scenario and really you're getting a lot of those issues, that would solve the problem. But I do find that the sleep for like 1 second every couple of modules, that does help as well. And quite often you only have to put that in like after 10 modules, right, that you're sending. And you may even have like other filters here, and so this one's not happening every time, etc. And so you do have to be quite strategic where that sleep gets put into the scenario. Okay, so that's 2 of them. Now the other really common error that we'll find is a 502. Now a 502 is generally like a not found or a not allowed type error. And you'll quite often get a 502 for the same reason that you get a timeout error. And the solution to them is pretty much the same thing. So you just add in your sleep here again for a 502, and that will most likely solve the error. But generally a 502 is more of like a server has banned you for a minute, you ping the server too often. But it's essentially the same solution for that as well. So hopefully that helps you resolve this error, because it is a very common one and an annoying one as well, because you'll have to rerun the scenario if you get that error.